I think the winter is a very different experience. As I mentioned, you have the Nordic Lights, which is quite a spectacular thing. You have to go for a few days because if it's cloudy, you won't actually see it. It doesn't occur in the same way every day. It's often better if it's extra cold, then you get some really nice crisp evenings and it can be a fantastic light show.
When I think of a holiday, I think of sun. Why would anyone want to go to the Arctic when it's so cold?
Well, some of us are thick-skinned and we think it's actually a bit of fun to see wildlife. I think the types of vistas, the types of experiences you can have in the Arctic is outstanding. I think very few people would turn away seeing a polar bear or getting close to Arctic fox, for example. So it's a fantastic place nature-wise, but not just that. Also, there's a very rich culture. It's the type of life that I think we all dread we would have to live, but we are mesmerized with actually seeing. So I think it's a real treat to be able to go up in the Arctic and get a real sense for what the top of the world looks like.
Now, what are the spots to visit in the Arctic?
Well, there's quite a few nice places. The easy part of the Arctic would be the parts that aren't permanently covered with ice, obviously. It's fair to say that the European part of the Arctic is a little bit more accessible than other places because the temperatures are a lot easier to cope with. So northern Norway, northern Sweden, northern Finland would be particularly easy where you're still within the Arctic Circle. Now, in my case, my mother was born north of the polar circle, so I always considered it home as well. But I would also say other parts, for example, in northern Alaska, northern Canada, or even in northern Russia, are becoming increasingly available to tourism type of operation. Now, there's several ways of doing it. You can either be on a ship and you travel around, you get a lot of exposure to different parts of the Arctic. Another way of doing it would be to just fly to one place. If you're doing it in the winter, you could of course also go on a dog sled. You have very different type of experiences, but bear in mind it's going to be dark the whole time. You will actually not see the sun. So a lot of the main focus for Arctic tourism is during a few weeks in the summer. That's when people feel it's easiest to get up there. Most places it's still very pleasant, but sometimes you can get the mosquitoes as well. So that would be the one thing to look out for. You don't want to get into too much mosquitoes. I would also say Greenland is a fantastic place. There's a number of fjord systems, there's big icebergs floating by. You can see things that you wouldn't be seeing anywhere else in the world. And of course the midnight sun is a great attraction to a lot of people. If you haven't seen the midnight sun, you really haven't seen the sun in all its glory. And in winter you have the opportunity to see the Nordic Lights, which is quite a spectacular experience. I was lucky to see it when I was up in Tromsø earlier this year, and it's the type of light show that you really would be paying big money for in other parts of the world.
So how can I get to the Arctic and how much does it cost?
Well, flying up there is generally not too difficult from most parts of the world. Depending on exactly where you want to go, it might be quite a long trip. I think when you get there, there's a couple of different options. One would be to stay on a ship. Then you'll probably see a lot more. Some of the tourism operators do a fantastic job up there, I must say. Depending on the size of the ship, you might have a more or less intimate experience in terms of seeing nature up and close. I would probably head for the 100 passenger type of ship. I think that has the great advantage of being more personal, yet provides you with lots of the amenities that you might find interesting to be in. If you're staying on land, there's a number of nice places to go. If you go in northern Scandinavia, for example, it is actually quite accessible. A lot of these areas are, I think, well catered to. There's nice hotels and so on. There are parts of northern Canada that can be really nice also. If you want to see polar bears, Churchill Bay and other places like that would be really nice. And increasingly, I think even in Russia, you can find some really interesting experiences as well. So it depends a little bit on what you're interested in and what kind of budget you have. Now, a trip by plane up there might cost you a couple of $1,000s, depending on where you're coming from, or less. Staying for a week or so, I would think if you're on a simple ship, it's a few $1,000s. If you're going for a luxury type of thing, it's maybe 10,000 and up. Depends on the type of cabins and what kind of experiences your operator would be offering.
So when's the best time to visit the Arctic?
So as I mentioned, I think there's 2 times a year. Either you're there in the summertime, and that's what most people would do. The great thing about that is you really can be up any time of day or night. I remember when I first came to Spitsbergen, the warmest day on the year was actually when I happened to be there. It was 10 Celsius, and it was 2 in the morning. Now, you know, some places you would think, oh, it should be pitch dark, whatever. Here, the sun is up around the clock, and it can actually be really pleasant. I think the winter is a very different experience. As I mentioned, you have the Nordic Lights, which is quite a spectacular thing. You have to go for a few days because if it's cloudy, you know, you won't actually see it. It doesn't occur in the same way every day. It's often better if it's extra cold, then you get some really nice crisp evenings and it can be a fantastic light show. I would think the fall and the spring are a little less interesting. Also, the weather can be a little bit unsettled some parts of the year, depending on where you're going.
So how is the tourism impacting the locals' life?
I think depending on where we are, you know, there's very different impacts. The Inuit communities in Greenland and northern Canada, for example, I think have now become accustomed in some places, but you know, it's not always an easy mix. And of course, there's in some ways a bad history in some parts of the world also. If you look at the Sami populations that you would find in northern Scandinavia and a bit into Russia, you know, they've already integrated in society much more, so I think they're much more used to it and perhaps less problematic type of things. Now, of course, there are positive impacts as well. You have situations where there's jobs being generated. Some of them can be a lot of fun, meaningful jobs, and I think it's also, you know, a good exchange of cultural experiences. So overall, I think it's a mixed bag. We obviously want to have more responsible tourism operators. And you know, it's always better to have not so much backpackers, but more people who actually also leave behind a bit of cash so that you help the local economy. Now, my experience is that Arctic people are incredibly friendly, and it's a delightful part of the world. And so if you have the chance to go up there, really do speak to people, engage with them, and be, you know, in a positive way, part of the environment.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us here in the studio. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
And thank you at home for watching. Don't forget to click back for more interviews like this.